one of the things that I found were stories about how he loaned money to lots of local people. And he would go out and ride around. Somebody would drive him around town. Might be a brother, a nephew, a friend. And they recounted stories of Eddie loaning small amounts of money to people, but he never asked to be repaid.
That was author and historian Dr. Lawrence Knorr, author of the book Gettysburg Eddie, about the great southpaw Eddie Plank. Hello and welcome to episode 137 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. Dr. Knorr will be my guest on the show today. He will be talking about Gettysburg Eddie Plank and his relationship with Philadelphia athletics legends like Connie Mack and Chief Bender. This is another conversation that was made available to members of the Irish American Baseball Society in video form before the audio version made it on the podcast. If you aren't a member of the Irish American Baseball Society, you can join us by heading to irishbaseball.org. If you are already a member, make sure you check out the Community Network website frequently. We are always keeping you up to date with what is happening with the organization. Special guests have been known to join us for live streams. We post all of our most up-to-date news of the organization, and we're always finding topics to bring members together in discussions. Let's get started with today's main conversation. Thanks for joining us, Lawrence.
My pleasure.
So you wrote a book, Gettysburg Eddie, about Gettysburg Eddie Plank, who is really one of the big stars of early baseball, but I think he is one of the names from early Major League Baseball that hasn't quite resonated as much as some of his contemporaries. So as we're starting, why don't you just talk a little bit about Gettysburg Eddie, the baseball player?
I mean, right off the top, he's definitely one of the best left-handed starting pitchers of all time. And you go back and you look at the numbers, and it's astounding, his wins. Of course, his ERA was during the dead ball era. And he pitched for championship teams quite a bit. Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's of the early 20th century were exceptional teams. But I think because he was maybe not the best player on his team during a lot of those years, he didn't get recognition as like the MVP, if they had it back then, of the Philadelphia Athletics in the American League. They didn't have Cy Young awards back then because Cy Young was still pitching when he started. So, I think the newspaper writers definitely thought very highly of him, but the most telling are the other great players he played against. And Ty Cobb really stands out as a left-handed batter, said Eddie Plank was the best left-handed pitcher he ever faced. So I think that right there tells you a lot about Eddie Plank.
Absolutely. And another thing that really speaks to his ability is he went straight from amateur baseball into the major leagues. He didn't have any stops in minor league baseball. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he even pitched for Gettysburg College when he did not attend Gettysburg College. Yeah. But that was a pretty big jump, especially at the time, right?
Absolutely. He was kind of a late bloomer. So as a late teenager, maybe around age 20, somewhere in that, I'm not sure exactly what year his local organized baseball team really picks up. But I have some history of that in the book of the early days in Gettysburg. And he's a little bit older when he's playing for the one-room schoolhouse team in Good Intent up the road from Gettysburg. And then, of course, he gets on the town ball team in Gettysburg, which travels even farther and wider. And then I believe the coach probably wanted to get him on the college team. We got to get him on the college team somehow. And he's a farm boy, and he's already beyond college age when people would start into college, not your traditional freshman. So they had to put him in the Gettysburg Academy, which was like a foundation school to catch up on maybe his academic shortcomings. And so not the best or brightest student that we know of, but he could sure pitch baseball. And he was at Gettysburg College for a little while. There's a lot of myths about that. This was the legends and lore of the early media, like because Gettysburg Eddie was at the Gettysburg College, and Christy Mathewson was in that same league. Obviously, they must have pitched against each other, and when they faced each other in the World Series, they talk about back in the college days when these boys faced each other. And of course, that never happened. Mathewson got his major league contract before Plank started pitching at Gettysburg College. So right to the majors, that was something that happened quite a bit more back in those days. But I think there's extenuating circumstances in that the American League was just starting in 1901, and pitching even back then was rare. And here you have this guy with this 3/4 delivery and almost a Steve Carlton-like slider, sweeper, whatever you want to call it, devastating pitch to left-handers, even to right-handers. He had a screwball that he could throw to right-handed batters that would go the opposite direction. And don't know that he threw exceptionally hard. Back in those days, the way those guys pitched so many innings is they were pitchers, not throwers. So, I could go on and on. He, gets to the major leagues, never pitches in the minor leagues after Gettysburg College.
Absolutely. And growing up in the Gettysburg area, he was born just a few decades after the Civil War. And I was wondering, it is, the 250th anniversary of the United States is coming up here. And when we look at major changing moments in U.S. history, obviously the Civil War is a big one, and it had even more influence in Gettysburg than other places throughout the country. Does that have any sort of impact on him? Was that still being felt in Gettysburg just a few decades later as he was being raised? Because he has this nickname, Gettysburg Eddie, and, he's basically the second most famous thing to happen there, but the most famous thing had just happened. And what was the impact of that on his life?
Yeah, he was born 12 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, 10 years after the end of the Civil War. My PhD is in history and early American history especially, and definitely Gettysburg looms large in American history, and I've read and studied a lot about it. Gettysburg was torn apart during that battle. If you could imagine the massive armies that far exceeded the populations of the people that lived there. Just think of the livestock that came through and died, the people that died, the soldiers and others who were buried on the grounds and then had to be exhumed and moved into national cemeteries or repatriated back down south. And so when he was young, because his family farm was on the path of one of the Confederate divisions that came in on the first day of the battle, his family fled. He wasn't born yet, but his ancestors had to flee. And so I think that was always a part of their lore. Our family was displaced by this battle, and even to this day, his grandson, whom I know, Eddie Plank III, talks about some of the artifacts that the family went back to their farm and found and donated later on, years later. Now, I think during the time he was pitching in the major leagues, Gettysburg and the Civil War, there were still GAR, Grand Army of the Republic organizations, sort of like your VFW or Legion Halls. It's the veterans of that war. They were still meeting. They were still kind of reconciling with the South. In 1913, the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, which was in the midst of Eddie's career when he's at his peak, there was a great reunion at Gettysburg, the 50th reunion. So if you're ever interested in that, go back and look at how a lot of those veterans who were still alive, now they're old men, and they meet each other on the battlefield and they're crying and hugging each other, even though they were fighting against each other 50 years earlier. So Eddie was very aware of the battle. Of course, the townspeople were, everybody in the nation was. When you said Gettysburg Eddie, it meant Civil War town Eddie, I think, more than anything, not Gettysburg in Adams County, where there's lots of apple trees and orchards. It's more about the battle and the Civil War for sure. I'll just mention one more thing about that. There was a lot of talk that he was a Gettysburg Park battlefield guide, but he was never officially that. He was just somebody who liked to tour the battlefield and would take his fellow ball players on rides through the battlefield and talk about what happened there, at least the bit that he knew. So very much tied to the family, the town, and to his certainly to his mindset. He was thinking about it quite a bit.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that he did sort of embrace that so much, and that he would, have this rumor that he was a tour guide because he would informally give people tours. That's such a great story. When we get back to his career and obviously playing in Philadelphia, I'm assuming one of the reasons that he played for the A's was it was easy for them to scout him, being just a few hours away in Gettysburg.
Yeah. Well, if you look at a map of the teams in those days, everything was east of the Mississippi except St. Louis. I think St. Louis was west of the Mississippi. Of course it is, but it was the St. Louis Browns. All the other teams were on the East Coast, around Philadelphia. You had the Phillies and the A's. In Washington, you had the Senators. New York had teams. Boston had multiple teams. Pittsburgh had a team. There were a lot of scouts. Not too far away. Philadelphia, Connie Mack. He was always looking for college ball players, up and coming ball players, and he had some inside information about Eddie Plank from a former player, and he invites him down to Baltimore, where the team is, and gives him a tryout and signs into a contract. He actually let him pitch in a game. I think it might have been before he signed the contract, but he don't think he had his official uniform yet. I mean, all Connie Mack had to do was see this guy and realize he was born in 1875. We just celebrated his 150th birthday. So he was almost 26 years old. So you think about that old adage about left-handed pitchers, left-handed hitters. Seems like they mature around that 26, 27-year-old age versus the right-handers tend to mature earlier. That's not always the case, but there seems to be some history to that. There was Eddie. He was just at the right age and ability. And he starts a little late, but he's very effective from the beginning.
Starting so late, how long was he able to continue to play?
So he was traded to the Yankees in 1918. He had last pitch in the major leagues in 1917 for the Browns. So if you do the math, his last game, it was right around the time of his 42nd birthday. He quit before the end of the season. I think he quit before his birthday. So he was probably 41. He was still under contract, traded to the Yankees. He did not accept that assignment. But what he did do is he went to pitch in an industrial league, which during World War I was a thing that the younger guys did to avoid serving overseas. Now, he didn't have to worry about that. He was in his 40s. He had a family. He was established. So I think he did that because he just wanted to pitch, have some competition. And he played for Steelton, Pennsylvania. So, he played until then. So say 42, going on 43. And then he becomes an umpire and more of a dignitary after that.
And how was his later life? I mean, I think sometimes we talk about some of these early ball players and they had their run of glory, and then after they played, things sometimes fell apart for some of them. But it feels like Eddie Plank kind of kept things together for most of his life, right?
Absolutely. He married late. He and Cora Meyer, they had a son, Eddie Plank II, only one child. So he really loved his family. They lived well. I mean, they weren't outwardly, overly rich, but upper middle class for sure. He invested well. He didn't waste money. He was a Mason. He was very devout in his church, I believe, a Presbyterian. He just a great citizen. of the town. Everybody respected him, knew him. I don't think anybody said a bad word about him. So he and his brother then start an auto dealership. So they fix cars and sell cars, and he's a part of that. I think he gets bored with that because he sells out. His brother Ira takes it on. Eddie is more of just a guy going on hunting trips, acting retired, but he's only in his late 40s. Sadly, he didn't live very long, though. He only lived to be about 50 years old, and he had a stroke. I was interested in an event that happened while he was pitching, or I was batting, and he was beamed and injured the back of his head and had a concussion and missed some time, which back then they didn't have batting helmets and all that. And he gets hit and obviously had a concussion. But later on, he has a stroke, which paralyzes the left side of his body. And of course, that left side of his body was so important to his career. He couldn't raise his left arm. He couldn't move his left leg with the stroke. And sadly, he died right around his 50th birthday. And I can tell you that tells you a lot, too. You read about the Eddie Plank funeral, just how many people came to little old Gettysburg for that in 1925. It was phenomenal. And a lot of the Philadelphia Athletics were there too, a lot of his teammates.
Yeah, that is a very interesting connection between taking that hit in the head when he was playing and then how he eventually passed, and wondering if there is some sort of connection there. And it makes you really happy for all of the technology that we have now that can protect players, especially now that we have 7 guys in every bullpen that can throw 100 miles an hour. I think we really are lucky to have all of those new technologies to protect players. You mentioned something that I want to get back to a little bit, because when we talk about American history, and you mentioned during World War I, these industrial leagues, and both of us live in Pennsylvania, and there were a lot of these. Bethlehem Steel had a number of teams that played, right. And this was a way for players who were active in Major League Baseball, because after the 1918 season, there was a law passed that said you either have to go to war if you're an able-bodied man of a certain age, or you have to do something to help the war effort. So right. A lot of these companies like Bethlehem Steel and other industrial companies would hire Major League Baseball players, give them a fake job, sometimes a real job, but the main purpose was so that they would play on their teams on the weekends. In Lebanon, Pennsylvania, they actually hired Babe Ruth. He was a runner for Bethlehem Steel. He only ended up playing 1 game before he got the Spanish flu, but he, played in the middle of rural Pennsylvania at the time as a way to avoid having to go to World War I. And for somebody like Eddie Plank, who didn't have to worry about going to World War I, but this had to be a great way for him to continue to play against the best levels of competition.
Yeah, I think I don't have any records of the exact reason, like there were no letters or anything of Eddie Plank and the Industrial League stuff that I'm aware of, but he ended up competing against Chief Bender, who was a teammate. So Chief Bender, the former great from the A's, he was in the same Industrial League. There were other players that were former major leaguers. So absolutely, I think the level of competition was fairly high. I don't know if I would call it AAA baseball, because a lot of the future Hall of Fame types were older. They were probably still effective, but maybe not Hall of Fame caliber. So we don't count those records as major league records, but a very fascinating part of baseball history that you can find a number of former major leaguers, and then you find other guys who were not major league baseball players, might have been minor leaguers or even local guys that are on these teams as well, playing against them. So yeah, Eddie would drive from his home in Gettysburg. He'd go up the Harrisburg Pike in his rickety car, whatever he was driving at the time. He had won a couple cars due to awards. And, he was in the auto business and was always probably had a pretty good vehicle that he could drive the 45, 50 miles or so up from Gettysburg to Steelton to Harrisburg.
So when you decided to write this book on Gettysburg Eddie Plank, what was it about this particular ball player that you said, I need to tell this guy's story?
Yeah. So I absolutely did not start out with somebody needs to write a biography about Eddie Plank, because I came to that realization, but I came to it because I did a book on Carl Scheib, who to this day is the youngest player who ever played in the American League. And he was a pitcher from up in Gratz, Pennsylvania, up the river a little bit, who as a 16-year-old is signed by the Connie Mack and the Philadelphia Athletics, and pitches against the New York Yankees in his debut, and is a bit of a phenom until he goes off to World War II for a couple years. Of course, he comes back and has a solid major league career. Well, I got to know Carl in his later years and put together his biography through interviews and research, and had a lot of fun with that, talking to somebody who knew that golden era of baseball, who had played in it. And then Chief Bender was somebody who ended up in that narrative. Chief Bender was Carl Scheib's pitching coach under Connie Mack. So there you have two people that connect back to Plank. Plank is dead by the time Carl Scheib comes along. They may have talked about Plank here and there at that point. He was largely forgotten back in the early 40s. But I was looking at Bender, and I thought, well, Bender was the pitching coach. Has anybody done a book on Chief Bender? And sure enough, there had been several. And his Native American history, Carlisle Indian School, all that's very interesting history. Kind of just a different human story in America than the vast majority of people when you see his Native American heritage. And so that was already a well-trodden path. And I looked at the teams Bender played on, and I thought, who's this Eddie Plank? He's a Pennsylvania Dutchman. I'm Pennsylvania Dutch. Maybe there's something to this. I looked into it, and nobody had written a biography at that point, a full-length biography. And there's good reason why, as I found out once I decided to start on it. There was no diary. There were no letters that remained. So I had to go back to I had to use Eddie Plank III and his family records, and then whatever I could glean from the newspapers, whether local or national, Philadelphia newspapers, reconstruct his career and try to reconstruct what he was like as a person. So very intentionally, this book is more of a recounting of the written records about Eddie Plank. Bear in mind, I cannot say, well, Eddie said this and Eddie said that, because Eddie didn't speak much and Eddie didn't write much. So if you read the book, you'll see, the games he played, the times he does appear in the newspaper, what was said about him almost always. People are talking about him. He's never talking about himself. He was very humble. And Connie Mack described him as being like a son and a real gentleman. And Connie and Eddie, when they traveled on the trains, would often sit together. So here you have the owner / general manager / manager of the team riding on the train with one of the star pitchers. Everybody else was in the back drinking, playing cards or whatever they're doing. But Eddie didn't partake in that.
Do you think one of the reasons that we don't have as many letters, or maybe he was a little more humble and we don't have as many records of interviews and things like that with him, is because of sort of his lack of education, that he might not have come up writing as much as some of the other players, so we don't have those letters? Do you think that is part of the reason that you had to dig so hard for this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely it's all evidence that he's a rural farm boy who could pitch. He gets looped into pitching for a college in the same league where Christy Mathewson, a very bright young man at college age, went to Bucknell, and was very articulate and could probably be a professor at a college later in life had he lived. So you have a lot of myth making in the media back then, and they made up a story about Eddie, and they made up a personality about him. At his core, he was a very solid, steady husband, father, um, you know, person in his town, in his community, always respected and loved. One of the things that I found were stories about how he loaned money to lots of local people. And he would go out and ride around. Somebody would drive him around town, might be a brother, a nephew, a friend. And they recounted stories of Eddie loaning small amounts of money to people, but he never asked to be repaid. Sometimes the people would repay him. Sometimes he would accept, sometimes he'd refuse. But he was never going out to collect. He was always going out to give. And I find that remarkable. So I think he truly was just a good soul. He might not have been all, the brightest person, and baseball players in general. You would not say that they were the academic elite of the time, right? So, but that's okay. I mean, I think what he lacked maybe in intellect, he had in his human character an extremely strong persona. So,
and you mentioned Chief Bender, and one of the things about him as a player is he really did have a lot of respect. You mentioned him being friends with Eddie Plank, and he was also friends with the great Jim Thorpe. And a lot of the areas where Jim Thorpe later in his life didn't have necessarily the same respect that Chief Bender got, which when you consider all of Jim Thorpe's accomplishments, but then he had his gold medals taken away from him. And there are even stories of Thorpe and Bender where Thorpe is almost lamenting how he was treated compared to Chief Bender. And I know your book isn't about Bender, but as a Native American who had success in Major League Baseball, but then he did sort of find that generalized respect among the community that maybe other athletes who were minorities would not have gotten at the time.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Chief Bender. These days, if you call a Native American chief, it's, some would see that as derogatory. We don't even want to use such things on, for team names and then such in a lot of places anymore. So, but chief to Chief Bender was a great compliment because it meant he was phenomenal. He was at the top of his game. He was impactful. I think Chief Bender, from what I've seen, and again, I'm no expert in Chief Bender, but sort of like Eddie Plank, a very sound character, great teammate. Guys love playing with Chief Bender. And he's just one of the guys. And he was a fantastic talent. And right. Interesting. It makes one wonder if we had just integrated baseball back then, how many of the guys just would have gotten along? Like here you got a Native American, Chief Bender, who becomes a Hall of Fame player in that league. Jim Thorpe also played in the major leagues, but didn't really stand out all that much. He was more of the consummate athlete, all around athlete, more of a football player and, someone who was in the field, track and field. But yeah, Bender, certainly, if you're reading about the dead ball era, the foundation, the nascent years of the American League, especially the A's, they're a great team to read about because they are very shortly the best team in the league for just about every year. They don't win every year. They don't always win the World Series. They often win the pennant. And Bender and Plank are a big part of that.
As a history writer, I mean, that is a huge focus of all of your books. And as we talk about the 250th anniversary of the country, I like to ask people in your position to sort of summarize how baseball has been intertwined into the story of American history, where maybe you don't need baseball to tell the story of American history, but you could use baseball as a way to tell almost any story. Obviously, Gettysburg Eddie Plank and the Civil War and his connection there, and then going up to World War I and Chief Bender. So you're talking about Native Americans and their relation to other Americans throughout history, you can really tell the story of the country through this sport that we all love.
Absolutely. Ken Burns did it so well with the baseball documentary that took you through the different innings, which were the decades or periods in baseball history. You have sort of mirroring the rise of the United States as an industrial power and as a military power, as a culture, as a consumer culture in the 1920s, especially World War II and everything that happens there, the 1950s, the golden era, the baby boomers coming along and their memories. So you think about all the phases of American history, and then you layer in the baseball of those eras, and it really aligns. And those of us that love baseball history love to connect American history to baseball history, because it's always at least if it's not front and center in affecting baseball, baseball is a pleasant distraction from some of the bad things and often accentuates the good things. I think about the 1920s, a fascinating era. You have Babe Ruth setting home run records in the house that Ruth built, and you have the roaring 20s happening economically as well. The company really rising into prominence economically. So, yeah, there are definitely parallels. And, you look at the post-Civil War era, while the Abner Doubleday myth is not true, Abner Doubleday being a general for the Union at Gettysburg, after General Reynolds was killed on the first day, it was actually Abner Doubleday who took his place with the First Army. So, but Abner Doubleday then gets credit for creating baseball. Well, baseball was already in the works for decades before that. In fact, baseball, forms of it had been played during the Revolution, just not organized into town teams or anything. So you see through some of the Civil War camps and activities, early baseball starting to come around, and then post-Civil War, of course, it takes off. The rules were a little different back then, but we do count the stats starting, I don't know what year it was, with the Cincinnati Reds and onward in the 1870s. But yeah, great connection, American history to baseball history. Eddie Plank is an excellent example of that.
And why don't you, just in the last few minutes we have together here, why don't you talk about some of the other, especially American history books that you have written and some of the other topics that you have covered in your writing?
Yeah, so very much in love with American history, especially up to the Civil War. I've written quite a bit with a team of writers, a couple other writers, Joe Farrell and Joe Farley. We traveled the Eastern Seaboard and went to the graves of all 200 founders of the United States. So everybody who signed a document was a major general or otherwise had some major influence on the founding of our country. So we visited their graves, we documented their situations, kept some statistics, and wrote biographies, put together. The fourth book is finally coming out shortly. We did then state books for each one, including Pennsylvania Patriots, New Jersey Patriots, New York, Connecticut, all the states. There's carve-outs. I would say locally as well, a couple books in Pennsylvania that are of interest besides Pennsylvania Patriots. I took a look at the Congress at York. If you're watching Ken Burns' The American Revolution, I think episode 5 covers when the Congress went into exile, but doesn't say a whole bunch about what they did. Well, they ended up writing our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and they did it in York, Pennsylvania. So we have a book called The Congress at York that talks about why the heck did they go to York and who was there and what did they do. The other one a lot of people don't know about are the presidents before George Washington. So the presidents of Congress, and that book's called Before George. And well, I've been involved in a lot of other books, some of them Pennsylvania Dutch history, regional history, but a lot of that early American history. So to me, it's just a passion. It's a lot of fun. I'm just so thrilled to be able to get up every day and think about this stuff.
And if somebody wants to pick up your book on Plank or even your book on Shibe, where would they go to buy some of your baseball-related books?
Well, you can get them anywhere books are sold. We really love when you get them at sunburypress.com, the publisher. So Sunbury like the town, sunburypress.com. Or get them at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or if you really want to, if you have a local bookstore that you love and they're not carrying it, we love when you go and ask for them to get it for you because it gets them thinking about it and maybe they'll stock it. So again, wherever books are sold, some of them are out on audio as well. And just about everyone's out on ebook as a Kindle too. So you get it in print, get it on Kindle, or most of them on audio.
Dr. Lawrence Knorr, thank you so much for being a guest on the Irish Baseball Podcast.
Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure.
I'm Rick Becker, and this has been episode 137 of the Irish Baseball Podcast.